Tell me, Biju, how did that debate go? Who spoke and what was the outcome?
Well, we had a very interesting person who is actually a pollster from Dubai. So he gave some insights into how these polls are done and how unreliable they are and so on. He has a very deep understanding of the election procedures and what could go wrong. And he was basically talking about the post ballots, and that is where the trick is going to be, according to him. And there's an exceptional situation. Of course, everybody agreed that there's a 10% lead for Biden, but that could be either neutralized or a huge battle in the courts is what he is predicting. So we all agreed that nothing is certain about American elections. But we all analyzed positives and negatives of both the candidates and so on. And all of us agreed that there is no Indian American identity for Kamala Harris. She is basically a Black American lady candidate, and she should be seen that way.
Absolutely.
And of course, we all agreed that whether it is Biden or Trump, it won't make much of a difference between India-US relations. Because whatever position Biden may have taken about Pakistan or Kashmir, when they come to power, they will realize the importance of India and work accordingly. So,
So can we get started? Okay. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the topic for this, our India's relationship with other countries, especially US and India and Canada. Sorry. So Ambassador Kapur, you'll be talking more on US relations, and Ambassador T.P. Srinivasan would be talking more on India's relations with US and Canada, so forth. So without further delay, let me introduce the moderator for the event, Anne Abraham. She's joining us from Canada. Anne, go ahead.
Welcome everyone to this third information from discussion session of this conference. I'm Dr. Anne Abraham, Treasurer of IAPC Alberta chapter. I'll be taking the role of a moderator for the session. On behalf of IAPC, it's my pleasure to invite all eminent panelists, journalists, people who are linked with the press and media, all the participants from all around the world to attend the 7th International Press Conference. Today in this session, our discussion topic is India's relationship with other countries, especially with US and Canada. Before introducing the panelists, let me give a few guidelines on the flow of the session. All participants should keep their audio muted during the session. Any questions related to the topic can be asked by keying into the chat box. At the end of the talk by the speaker, I shall cue in your questions. Each panelist will be sharing their thoughts and views for 20 minutes, and the question and answer session would be for 10 minutes. I'm pleased to introduce and welcome our panelists to the session for having an in-depth discussion and dialogue. Welcome Ambassador T.P. Srinivasan and Ambassador Pradeep Kumar Kapur to the session of this conference. At the first speaker for the session, let me introduce very respected Dr. T.P. Srinivasan, former Ambassador of India. Dr. T.P. Srinivasan is a former Ambassador and Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations, Vienna, and Governor of India to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Vienna, and Ambassador to Austria and Slovenia. T.P. Srinivasan has served in the Indian Foreign Services for 37 years. Few of his previous postings were as Deputy Chief of Mission in the Embassy of India, Washington, High Commission of India to Kenya, and Permanent Representative of India to United Nations of Nairobi. Dr. Srinivasan has nearly 20 years of multilateral diplomacy experience and has represented India at several international conferences. He has authored books and contributes articles regularly to Indian and foreign publications. As we are highly delighted to be here in our conference, let's hear what he has to say about today's discussion topic. Welcome, Dr. T.P. Srinivasan, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I would say good midnight to all of you. I just woken up from bed. all ready to speak about India's relations with the US and the rest of the world. In fact, that's too huge a agenda. So I might confine more to the United States rather than to the whole world. And Canada, I know very little. I have never served in Canada. And our relations with Canada has always been very happy and uncomplicated. But India-US relations have been like a roller coaster ride ever since India became independent. And it's been going up and down all the time. And fortunately, at this particular moment in time, it is at its highest point ever, India-US relations. We used to call India and US are two estranged democracies in the past because both are democracies. There was every reason for us to be friendly and cordial, but it became estranged because of the circumstances, because our non-alignment was considered hostile by the United States, and the Cold War, where we were closer to the Soviet Union rather than the United States. And so that period was over. And once after the Cold War, of course, there was no logic for India and the United States to be estranged. So we began a period of engaged democracies. And it was during the second term of President Clinton that a whole exercise was started by President Clinton as to why India and the United States were not friendly enough. We used to call it, India a gap in his understanding of the world, and he wanted very much to visit India. And therefore, he set up a task force to study what is wrong with India-US relations, how can we rectify it. So the answers were very clear. First and foremost was the past relationship. Second was the nuclear issue, which is almost unsolvable because we had not signed the NPT. And the United States has considered the NPT to be the center of their global policies. And then we started talking about it. And there was a near consensus that President Clinton should go to India. And that was when Mr. Gujral was the prime minister. And he was an interim prime minister in a way, and therefore it did not happen. And then all was set. The new prime minister took over, Mr. Vajpayee. And I was in Washington. We started talking about the president's program, schedules, and everything. And on May 11th, 1998, we had this dramatic nuclear explosion. I remember it very well, that particular day. It was the darkest day in my official career because that is the day when we started a diplomatic relationship without being able to talk to each other. I remember going to the State Department and sitting across Ambassador Rick Kinderforth and not talking about anything because they said we have nothing to talk. What you have done is criminal and please choose your punishment. You want to be drowned, hanged, poisoned, whatever. They talked about total betrayal and so on. So 2 or 3 days, we did not even talk about anything. They said, we don't want to hear you. Please tell us what you want to do. And that I've never seen a relationship like that at any time in my diplomatic career with any country. Anyway, so we passed all that. And then we had this very famous talks between Jaswant Singh of India and Stop Talbot of the United States, the Deputy Secretary of State. It took 2 years, 1998 to 2000. And we traveled all around the world. We all earned a lot of airline mileage because these two gentlemen could not meet in one place. So we're meeting in all over the world. And all of us tagged along, sometimes airports in Europe, sometimes in a godforsaken country in some corner of Africa. So this went on for 2 years. And that was the most intensive conversation that India and the United States ever had on all aspects. And the effort was to try and convince our friends in the US that India's growth or India's defense capability, including its nuclear capability, is not going to hurt the United States. There was nothing that could happen which the United States should be worried about India's strength or capacity. And we shared a lot of intelligence as to what our concerns were. It was quite obvious that Pakistan was not our major concern, but our Pakistan was, our concern was China, in which there is a certain sympathy and understanding with the United States also, that although at that time US had a good relationship with China, they knew and we knew that we could not trust China. And therefore, on that basis, we moved towards an understanding on our nuclear policy. Again, the government changed. But before that, President Clinton went to India in 2000, when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister. And that was a historic visit. And I would say that was the landmark in the change in relationship. But the nuclear issue was still not resolved formally, even though there was a lot of understanding between these two gentlemen, which could become the basis of our relationship. But still, President Clinton went there and he said that we have resolved everything. There's a new architecture in our relationship. But there are a few things like the nuclear issue, which is yet to be solved. India has to sign the NPT, which he knew we would not. And then Prime Minister Vajpayee came to Washington in December 2000. That was the last days of my posting to Washington. And that was a very, very successful visit. You will still see the Mahatma Gandhi statue, which was unveiled by both President Clinton and Prime Minister Vajpayee in front of the Indian Embassy in Washington. And that was a culmination of a new relationship. But it was actually carried forward by the next government, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, which announced in 2005 that there was going to be a nuclear deal between our two countries. This, I'm sure many people will remember, because even after it was declared that the nuclear deal will be signed, it took us 3 years of negotiations. Again, very long and very arduous negotiations as to how India's nuclear capability could be legitimized without India signing the treaty. So this was a hard task, and we accomplished it in the sense that India was considered not a nuclear weapon state, but a responsible, technologically advanced state. And that was the kind of euphemism for a nuclear weapon state without being acknowledged as such, with a bachelor with a wife in the cupboard kind of situation. That the wife is recognized that she is in the cupboard, but everybody pretended as though the cupboard was empty. And that was the kind of situation we reached in 2008. And after that, of course, there was no issue between India and US. And even today, there is no issue as such, a fundamental issue, which prevents our relationship from progressing. And then President Obama went to India in 2010, when there were further discussions about security in the Indian Ocean, India-Pacific, all kinds of understanding was reached. Of course, the elephant in the room was always China, as to how we would deal with China. And it proceeded like that. But towards the end of Dr. Manmohan Singh's years, because of internal issues, scams and problems and various kinds, not much attention was given to India-US relations. And things went on, but nothing dramatic happened till Mr. Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister in 2014. I'm just rushing through the whole thing. And look at the situation in 2014, Mr. Narendra Modi became Prime Minister. He was one who was denied a visa by the Americans for 5 years. I had Mr. Narendra Modi in Washington in 1999 when he was an ordinary General Secretary of the BJP. He came there to have an understanding of the situation. Other than that, since then, he asked for a visa several times to visit India and visit USA, and he was not given a visa. So Mr. Modi should have been the most hurt or inimical person, but he forgot that completely. And he understood that in his policy, he had 4 priorities in his foreign policy. First is security, second is economic development, third is neighbors, and fourth is the Indian diaspora. So in all these 4 pillars of his foreign policy, he realized that the most important actor is going to be the United States. So he forgot all that. People asked him, why are you so friendly with the US? What happened to the denial of visa? He said, why? Nothing. They are privileged to deny me a visa. Now they are giving me a visa, so I'm going there. So because he realized the importance of it, and he did not make just one visit. He made several visits to Washington, not only to Washington, but also to the West Coast. He met Facebook and Twitter and the whole works, and he took United States by storm. His meeting in New York in the park was a historic visit where thousands of Indian Americans joined. And in fact, President Obama called him a rock star after he came out of that function. So it was a complete transformation. And from 2014 to 2016, so many good things happened between India and the United States. And when he visited, when Mr. Modi again was the 5th time to the US, he addressed the US Congress and he said, here now is a new symphony in India-US relations. What he meant was that the orchestra is the same, we are all the same players, the same musical instruments, but you will hear a new orchestra, new symphony. And that is, he really meant that because it was a completely different relationship. And the secret of the relationship was not only the nuclear deal, but also the very close defense cooperation that India established. In fact, the hero of that was Dr. Pranab Mukherjee, who had come to Washington and agreed a deal to purchase arms. So with these two things, we moved on. We signed some very basic, there are about 4 basic agreements that you have to sign with the US if you were to have a very close collaboration. And we signed the 3 of them of that. Those were considered, impossible to sign at one stage. But Mr. Modi, as he said, I have no historical inhibitions, hesitations of history, and we moved forward. And so we had this fabulous relationship in 2016, and things were moving well. But then it was discovered that this very close relationship with the United States was creating some ripples in our relationship with China and Russia. And therefore, Mr. Modi decided to have a more balanced, not equidistant, but equally close relationship with all the 3, because he was not in favor of a Cold War. And so he went to Wuhan, the famous Wuhan today, known for something else. But he went to Wuhan on an agenda-less summit with President Xi Jinping. Then he went to Sochi at a similar meeting with Vladimir Putin. And he developed a kind of equitable, of course, closest relationship was with the US, but equally warm and friendly relationship. And that is how we were till very recently. And then, of course, the COVID came. It was a huge challenge to everybody. It still is. And of course, before that, President Trump became president, and Mr. Modi came to Washington in 2017. We had a good conversations with him. In spite of all the signals, contradictory signals that came out of Mr. Trump, he criticized India for his trade policy, and he said India was exploiting the United States, etc. But in spite of all that, basically and fundamentally the relationship continued, and it was actually strengthened under Mr. Trump. But unfortunately there the situation was that it was, as you know, President Trump was rather unpredictable in many ways. He would praise you one moment, and the next moment he would criticize you. And so you needed a lot of balancing to carry on with President Trump. But it became better and better as time went on. And of course, all of you will remember Howdy Modi in Texas, and also Namaste Trump in India. So our relationship could not be any better in all aspects. The old idea of keeping Pakistan and India balanced was abandoned. Mr. Trump called Pakistan liars for not utilizing the money given to fight terrorism, and they were joining the terrorists even while receiving all these support from the United States. China-US relations, of course, as you know, it was good at one time, then it deteriorated. Under Mr. Trump, there was a trade war situation and so on. But anyway, all these changed with COVID because now the enemy was not anything else except this little unknown virus. And the whole globe was going to change. It was quite obvious. We still don't know the extent of that change. We still don't know how this virus will chew the world and leave it in what kind of shape. We don't know. Not only we don't know, and we don't know when it will change, etc. So into this uncertain world, we walked in 2020. Of course, in the beginning of 2020, there were signs of a war because of the killing of the Iranian general and a slight coalition with Iraq and the United States. So 2020 didn't begin very well for the world, but we didn't expect what would happen. We thought it started badly, but by then already in China, the virus was creating big damage, and the Chinese did not even let us know the extent of the problem there was. So we are in this process of readjustment in the time of the virus. And the saddest part of it was the most important country in the world, the most powerful country, the most scientifically advanced country, the most medically advanced country, was the worst affected by COVID. And an impression was created that the United States is going to fall apart in spite of all its strength. And there was going to be a vacancy of a global leader because President Trump was not very much interested in becoming the global policeman or anything like that. And therefore, the way he withdrew into a shell, as it were, with America first, and at the same time, COVID creating havoc in the country. So it was a desperate kind of situation in the world as a whole. And none of us know, and even we do not know now, what the eventual outcome of this would be, what the post-COVID world war will be. And then lo and behold, we saw the Chinese working on our side of the Himalayas, most unexpected, because China itself was in the dock as the one who created the crisis, or at least someone who hid the crisis and thus hurt India, hurt the world. But for no reason, they virtually invaded into our part of what is called the line of actual control. And this was a big surprise to us. We were not prepared. Of course, we are not as unprepared as we were in 1962. But this time also, we did not expect this, particularly in the middle of this. China is still to explain why they did that. But they did that not only to us, but also to other countries. They did that to Taiwan. They went to the South China Sea. They did it to Hong Kong. They did occurrences to ASEAN countries. And generally, China was flexing its muscles all around the place. And this is what changed the situation again in India-US relations. And India dealt with this Chinese menace in 3 different ways. One is to have a conversation, asking them to withdraw to their original places, as we were all in April 2020. The second was to prepare ourselves to fight a war if necessary. So we started building up our military equipment, technology. We had the Rafale fighters from France. And so we got prepared because if there was no other way, this was the only way that we treated the Chinese. And the third, we learned a little lesson from the United States by imposing some economic restrictions, commercial restrictions on China. And these three things are proceeding, but at the same time, nothing has happened. Several agreements were reached for disengagement from China. But even today, they seem to be occupying something like 1,000 kilometers more than what they had occupied earlier in Aksai Chin. That's about 43,000 square miles. And now another 1,000 square kilometers have been added to that. And it's a first-rate crisis. If they don't disengage, if they don't return to their rightful positions, what do we do? So it is here that India-US relations have become prominent. Because the only country which has come forward to support India in this context is the United States. Russia, as you know, is closer to China. Europe is in some kind of disarray. The Brexit has not fully happened, but European Union is far apart. Russia trying to catch hold of Europe. And in Southeast Asia, the Chinese activities, Indian Ocean. And therefore, the whole old proposal that Barack Obama made earlier of having a pivot to Asia in the Indian Ocean and the so-called Indo-Asian Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. And that was revived. It was there was something called a quadrilateral, that is 4 countries, United States, India, Japan, and Australia, had already got together in 2017. But for fear of provoking China, this was kind of lying dormant. But for the first time in history, these 4 countries met in Tokyo, knowing fully well that their charter is now laid out. These 4 countries have to meet the threat from China. Of course, China called it a mini NATO or Asian NATO or Indo-Pacific NATO, etc., etc. But the most forthcoming country at that meeting was United States. Mr. Pompeo spoke in specific terms as to what the danger to the world was. And he proposed that we move on to a military or a strategic understanding among the 4 of us. And we are there already. But the other 3 countries were more cautious. India did not even mention China. But Japan said that this is not against any particular country. But Australia's relations with China had deteriorated. So US first, Australia second, Japan third, and India fourth. This was the kind of lineup in the Quad, which is a major move. So we are now almost allies. We used to say India and the United States are natural allies. That is the language that we used to say. Now we are almost allies in that sense, because if the Chinese do go to war, we would expect support from United States more than any other country. And it is not a matter of United States fighting the war for us. That's not the idea. But the idea is to have a global support, the equipment, the machinery, the intelligence, and all this. And an understanding has been reached. And that is why I said today's relationship with the United States is at the height. The roller coaster has reached really on top. And the important thing is to keep it there in spite of whatever is happening. But then you know that in a few days' time you have an election. And all eyes are set on that. 2 things are very crucial in the global relations today. First is the pandemic, the vaccine, where it will come from, who will come out with it, who will all be helped, where does India stand, where does Russia stand. So that's one issue. And the second issue is the election, and what changes will be there, if any, in the US administration, and how will that administration look at China and India, and what would be the posture of the new president or the old one renewed, whichever is the situation. But I'm very confident that there will be no change in this, whether it is Biden or Trump, because your interests, US interests in that region are identical with those of India. And therefore, this relationship will only grow and not be retarded by any reason. And interesting thing is, just a few days before the election, your defense secretary and secretary of state are visiting India physically, not online. They're traveling to India to have what are called 2+2 talks, which means 2 foreign ministers and 2 defense ministers. This is a very, very important meeting just a few days before the elections. So which means they are presuming that there is a bipartisan support to this whole initiative. And the 4th agreement which forms the fundamental relationship, is likely to be signed during this time. So we are going into the election with a strong relationship with the United States, in the expectation that whatever happens to the elections, the relationship will continue. So this is the long saga of India's relations with the US, about which I am familiar, because I was dealing with these right from, 1980 onwards, different postings in the United States. And so I have seen the worst and the best. But I remain optimistic, and I cannot conclude this without talking about the role of the Indian Americans and also the Indian American press in all this. When I was in Washington, my strongest support was the Indian press, including India abroad. So the press played a big role in normalizing relationships. They were like watchdogs of this relationship. So I'm sure your Indo-American Press Club will also be interested to know that things are on the upswing. And Indian Americans, whether they vote for Kamala Harris or somebody else or whatever may happen, they will continue to be interested in India, because their future lies in a good relationship between India and the United States. So if H1B visas are not available, if our families cannot join, all these immigration problems, it can be resolved only if India and America are on good terms. So you have a stake in this. And that is why Indian Americans played a big role in the Congress, in the Senate, and also at the time of the nuclear deal. So you have made a big investment in this particular area. And therefore, the role of the Indian Americans will also be stronger, and will continue to develop this relationship. So I have only good news as far as this is concerned, but there are anxieties. The COVID anxiety, the China anxiety, and what the policy of the United States will be in 2021. As far as Canada is concerned, one good thing is that we have the largest number of Indians in a foreign cabinet in Canada. What more do you want? So we have a very close relationship, and culturally, traditionally, there's no problem between India and Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister visited India, and it was all sun and cheer and happiness and wine, and cake, and there is nothing to worry about. There may be issues, but Indians seem to be very happy in Canada. And we also seem to be happy with the Canadians. So I'm not going into any other relationship, because I don't think there is time. I've already exceeded. So thank you very much for giving me this splendid opportunity to recall all these life experiences, as it were, in India-US relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. T.P. Srinivasan, sir, for your valuable and enlightening thoughts about the Indian relationship with foreign countries. We appreciate your time, and then your session was highly informative. Thank you so very much, sir. Moving into the next speaker for the session, Ambassador Pradeep Kapur is an acknowledged luminary diplomat with a distinguished career, working with leaders and policymakers in different continents of the world, especially Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. Author and editor of many books, he was Ambassador of India to Chile and Cambodia, and Secretary at the Indian Ministry of External Affairs before joining as an academic in reputed universities in USA and in India. A graduate of a globally acclaimed Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, he is Executive Director of a Smart Village Development Fund, International Economic Strategic Advisor, and many more. He is numbers as we all witnessed the release of the much anticipated and timely book, Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic, Envisioning a Better World by Transforming the Future of Healthcare, authored by Ambassador Pradeep Kapur and Dr. Joseph Chalil. We are all familiar with some of the relationship dysfunctionalities with our home country and with US or Canada. However, we are eagerly looking forward to hearing on this topic, India's relationship with other countries, especially US and Canada, from very respected Ambassador Pradeep Kapur. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Pradeep Kapur over to our virtual platform. Sir, you're muted.
Sir, you can talk now.
Thank you finally for unmuting me. I was telling you that I cannot unmute myself. Whoever is the host has to unmute me. But it was not easy to get across the message. Finally, I guess it got across. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasan. It was very interesting to listen to your speech and see you paint the broad strokes of the landscape of our relations with the US and to some extent with Canada. And that reminds me of an anecdote we had, in the Ministry of External Affairs when Foreign Secretary Dixit was finishing his tenure and retiring from his job as a Foreign Secretary. We had the Minister of External Affairs, Dinesh Singh. We had the Deputy Minister of External Affairs, the Bhatia, Raghunandan Lal Bhatia ji, and then we had the Minister of State, Salman Khurshid. So we were all gathered in the quadrilateral. I do not know if you remember, were you there at that time in Delhi? I do not know that, but I was there in Delhi in the ministry at that point of time. So, the Minister Dinesh Singh first started by giving a long speech about the great work done by Foreign Secretary Dixit. He was followed by the Deputy Minister, Raghunandan Lal Bhatia, speaking, much the same thing and some more. And then finally, when it came to Salman Khurshid's turn, he said that my speech is like the triplicate copy of the two speeches before me. So I want you to consider it as submitted. So I'm going to draw a leap from that episode and say that you can consider my speech as submitted because Ambassador Srinivasan has painted it very beautifully and he's mentioned all the points which I was planning to also discuss about. So what I propose is the following. Since we are here with a very distinguished group of journalists, and I've always enjoyed my interactions with journalists all over the world. I've worked in almost all the continents except Australia, as Anne explained. Thank you, Anne, for that, giving my background. I appreciate that. So, working with journalists always has been a great source of learning for me and a great source of pleasure. So I'm very happy to be with all of you. And it's a very sort of important time. I consider it in the history of the world and the history of nations. We are at a very critical juncture. And the way things are going, things can either go bad completely or they may come under control. One doesn't know. Journalists always have a very keen sense of understanding of, history and the current and the future. So what I would also propose is that as soon as I finish my very brief remarks, I will not make it elaborate because you've already heard the broad strokes from Ambassador Srinivasan. So I would rather make it a more interactive discussion. I'll be very happy to sort of take on questions and comments from the journalists and respond to those comments and questions. So why I say it is at a tipping point in the world is the following, that with all that has been happening in the recent past in terms of COVID-19, in terms of the action in Ladakh, which Ambassador Srinivasan has also mentioned, and in terms of all the other incidents and events taking place in the South China Seas, in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan, and terrorism globally is another big area of concern. But besides, if you keep aside terrorism on one part of your table and look at the other part of the table and look at the major conflicts in the world today, other than Azerbaijan and Armenia, the bigger conflicts in the world today are all centered around China. So China has sort of become the hotspot. So instead of talking about US, India, or India, Canada, because India, Canada also to some extent has been covered, I was the Deputy Secretary Americas in Delhi in the early 90s, looking after our relations with US and Canada and Mexico from the Ministry of External Affairs. And I also had an occasion to work here in Washington, D.C. as a faculty at Georgetown University, the first time any officer from the Government of India or from the Ministry of External Affairs was sent on a teaching assignment abroad by the Government of India, and it was under a UN assignment, UN fellowship. So I sort of understood some aspects of the interactions in my interactions with the US Embassy and the US, senators and visiting delegations. So like Ambassador Srinivasan mentioned on one occasion, when we had the visit of the US Navy Chief to India, this was in 92, 93, and we were having a bilateral dialogue on how we can progress our military relations, defense relations between the two sides. Ambassador Pickering was there in Delhi at that time, and we had our Indian Navy Chief, Ambassador Pickering, myself, and the US Navy Chief in that same room for the meeting, amongst some other delegates. And the meeting, the way it went, all of us will be very shocked to hear that both the US Navy Chief and Ambassador Pickering and the Indian Navy Chief, they all started talking at the same time. And they were not talking to each other, but talking at each other or talking beyond each other. And the decibels in the room kept on going up and up. So that is how the meeting ended. I saw quite a few of these meetings in Delhi, ending in what I perceived it as failure between the US and the Indian side. And they also were very keen to sort of poke their nose into the Punjab situation at that time on terrorism. So we had to sort that out with some difficulty in collaboration with the US Embassy at that time. But as we have heard earlier, we have made a lot of progress, and I'm based out of Washington, D.C. So when I attend meetings here with think tanks and academics and, meet up with the congressmen or senators in different places, the sense I get and what I hear is that the relations are now going to be on an even keel mostly, with some glitches, of course, all the time amongst two big democracies which are very sort of adamant about their positions. Glitches will always be there. But overall, the strategic community and the political elite in the US is fairly unanimous in their view that their relations with India are some of the most important priority relations for US with any country in the world. So even if you see the caucus, the India caucus in the US Senate, the biggest caucus in the US Senate is that of India. It has a large number of members. 1/3 of the Senate is a part of the India caucus. No other country has such a big caucus. The co-chairs of the caucus from the Democrats and the Republican side had earlier written to President Obama that on every issue, both the Democrats and the Republicans are absolutely united on any issues concerning India in terms of enhancing our relations with India. A similar letter was sent to Donald Trump by the two co-chairs of the India caucus again when he took over, saying the same thing, that on India, both the parties are absolutely unanimous in their opinion that the relations are important and they need to go ahead. Privately in meetings, the congressmen and senators do express their fear about China very significantly. It's the major sort of nightmare currently in their sort of spectrum or graph. So they have been having a lot of expectations from countries around the world, and their expectations from India are also very high currently. They have made very strong statements which have never been made before. If you analyze the joint communiques between India and US so far, or any other statements which have been issued, as compared to what I have heard coming out in the last year or two. and particularly in the last few months by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. So what I see evolving is a scenario where they do get, tremendously frustrated when they come back from visits to India, because they do make a large number of visits to India. A lot of delegations go, and even in the time of John Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, when he visited India, he came back, and in a very small meeting in the State Department, where one of my close friends was present in that meeting, Kerry said that India is the most uncivilized nation in the world. That was his feedback when he came back from a meeting. This is not too far back, this Obama administration. So they do get frustrated tremendously. It's very, very difficult for them to deal with India and to understand India. And they are partly to blame for their attitude. Their cultural nuances between the two countries are very different, and the egos of the two countries are very different. So how we deal with each other, how we try to understand the other's viewpoint, that is going to be more and more important as we go along in the future. And if India-US relations are going to become the defining partnership of the 21st century, which there is a good possibility, I guess the most important work will have to be done not only by the two governments, but by all the people I see on the two screens here today, the Indo-American Press Council people, the journalists from our two countries, the diaspora in our two countries, have an equally important role to play as ambassadors of India. And I see you all as ambassadors of India. So you have to see how to foster a better understanding of the other country. And even if you're in Canada, you can do the same with India and Canada relations. I differ somewhat with Ambassador Srinivasan's painting a very rosy picture of our relations with Canada. It is very good. I dealt with Canada. We have difficulties on terrorism aspects, the way they sort of they look the other way. And even some of their cabinet ministers, 4 out of 22 are Indian origin people. Some of them are related to terrorists, known terrorists, and they do not have any sort of great positions against terrorism in favor of India. It's with great difficulty that just last month, some statement was forced out of them on terrorism. Before that, they have been very ambivalent. And I have had the detailed interactions with Canadian delegations, including one very embarrassing one of the most embarrassing incidents in my life, where the father of the current Prime Minister was in India for a visit, Pierre Trudeau, as Prime Minister of Canada, and I was Deputy Secretary Americas at that time. And we were, we were called in for a meeting in the suite in the hotel, in his suite, because he wanted a prior meeting before the delegation meeting. So the Canadian ambassador was there. I was there as Deputy Secretary Americas. There was a couple of other aides from his side, Canadian High Commissioner in Delhi, not the ambassador. So we walked in, we sat down, and after 5 minutes, Pierre Trudeau emerged into the suite room for the meeting, absolutely in his birthday suit, without wearing a single stitch on him. And he carried on the meeting as if it was absolutely a normal thing. For me, it took me a few minutes to get out of the shock of seeing a Prime Minister completely in that shape. But anyway, those sort of things also diplomats experience in their life, just as a side comment. So what I would like to say further before, getting into the interactive mode with all of you who are already well versed in a lot of these aspects, is the following: that China today is seen as a country which is, creating a lot of problems for many countries and many regions, but especially for India in the borders in the Himalayas. China has created a lot of problems for India on so many issues in the recent past and not recent past either. In terms of the nuclear suppliers group, which Ambassador Srinivasan may recall, till Bush sort of picked up the phone and talked to them, talked down to them, they didn't buckle in for that agreement. Then they have also been very, very difficult in the UN reforms, opposing it tooth and nail, in the branding, in the naming of the terrorists, listing of the terrorists, and the fatwa thing. that FATA blacklisting of Pakistan, etc. So wherever India's interests are concerned, it is very difficult to think of any instance where China has sort of acted positively or favorably in India's interest in any case. They keep on issuing statements about Ladakh, as they have done recently. So for me, I am a little confused, and you guys need to clarify my confusion. I see, if I sit in as an Indian on a table and I try to analyze the scorecard of China and the scorecard of US vis-a-vis India, on one scorecard, I don't see personally, as a diplomat, former diplomat, I don't see anything positive as happening in the last so many years or now or in the future. On the other hand, I see very strong positive statements coming out of Washington, D.C., Mike Pompeo making these statements repeatedly on so many important occasions where they are laying out the sort of policy statements for the future of US foreign relations, where they're talking very strongly, positively about their relations with India and about the India-China problem, totally in India's favor, not one word in China's favor. So seeing that sort of scenario and seeing the world, when I interact with the Chinese scholars here in Washington, D.C., or on conferences with scholars coming in from, Beijing also in different time zones, what I see is that there is a lot of hesitation, fear in China today on the following issues. I can sense it very, very clearly. They fear, the worst nightmare for China is the following, that the Quad becomes active and Quad becomes effective and Quad becomes Quad plus plus. That Australia, Japan, India, and US do not keep at just these four, but it becomes plus plus and a very effective sort of grouping. That is the biggest fear. The other big fear I see is that they are totally perplexed that in spite of the Belt and Road Initiative and spending billions of dollars on the projects in so many countries of the developing world, including in Africa, Asia, Latin America, they have been stridently demanding, not asking but demanding, statements of support for China's position on issues like Hong Kong, on issues like the India-China conflict at the border, on issues like Taiwan, on so many issues. And what they tell me, what I hear in these meetings is a total wall of silence from all these countries. Not one country is stepping forth to make open statements in China's favor on these issues, maybe other than, if at all, and that too also not very prominently, either Pakistan or Iran or North Korea, which anyway are not the foremost nations in the world map. So they are totally perplexed as to how, after hand holding to such an extent and giving them so many billions of dollars worth of projects and aid and loans, they are not able to elicit any support or response. So that is their second big worry, that their actions are not fetching them any brownie points or any traction in the world. So these two things are big worries. So what perplexes me and confuses me even more is, for a country, whatever history of the world, I know I was an engineering student, as Anne mentioned, and I was asked a lot of history questions during my IAS interview. So without having done world history, but the chairman insisted on asking history questions. So thereafter I started reading a lot more about history because I couldn't answer many of the questions at that time. So what I see is that no country in the world can emerge as number one country, and the trending sort of hashtag in China till last year was China number one. So everything they wrote, it had a hashtag China number one. So all Chinese in the US also, when they would do Baidu or any of their other social media, they would put China number one as their hashtag, which meant that China is soon going to overtake US as the number one country in the world, as a global hegemon. Suddenly that hashtag is becoming sort of less popular, let us put it that way. Now, a country which is opening up so many fronts simultaneously, it's opened up Hong Kong against an international agreement with Britain, which is lodged in the United Nations, of giving the freedoms to Hong Kong, which they had till 2047. And here we are in 2020, 27 years before their legal obligation ends. They've already taken many steps, which you all know about as journalists and as colleagues. Then on the South China Seas, they have militarized and created artificial islands and are taking head on the US. They are taking on all the littoral countries. I don't want to list them here because all of us are very familiar with those. Then they are threatening Taiwan with excises. Then you have Xinjiang, then you have Tibet, then you have India. Then you have, their global attitude after coronavirus. Now, for any country in the world, it baffles me if you are aiming to be China number one. Is that a realistic posture? Is that a realistic attitude to pick up so many fights? Now, the strongest country in the world or the strongest individual in the world can never fight, more than 2 or 3 people unless it's a Bollywood movie or a Hollywood movie. So you sort of can get swarmed very easily. Here you're opening up 8 flanks, 10 flanks at the same time. Do you have that much power? Do you have that much strength? Is what confuses me all the time. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to leave it open now for discussion and interaction. And I'd be much happier answering questions rather than making it a one-way monologue. So that'd be more interesting with journalists, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasan.
And can I just interrupt you for a second? Okay, those of you who would like to ask any questions, if you could raise the hands on the chat itself, Anne will introduce the question and you could speak up.
And Ambassador Srinivasan, we have to thank him specifically for keeping awake in this unearthly hour in India to be here with all of us. So a big round of applause for Ambassador Srinivasan first.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador Pradeep Kapur, for taking the time to speak to us and share your valuable thoughts. So now it's time for taking up the questions. So if anyone do have questions, please create me.
Hi, this is Ajay.
Go ahead.
Hi. Can I answer the question, please?
Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
My question is, there is a lot of apprehension about if Biden comes to power, Biden-Harris ticket wins the election in the US, they are going to be less favorable to India and more towards China or Pakistan. What are your thoughts? Are we in a better shape with Biden than with Trump?
Who is that addressed to?
Well, I shall take the first shot, then you can add to that.
Absolutely, sir.
Many presidents of the United States, when they were not in office, were not great friends of India. George Bush could not even remember the name of the Indian Prime Minister when he was the presidential candidate. And Barack Obama was willing to vote against the nuclear deal. So what politicians do when they are in the opposition or out of office will be different from what they do when they are in office, because that is when they realize the geopolitical importance of India. So whatever these two people may have said about India, but this was not against India in that sense. They were talking generally in terms of human rights, in terms of freedom, without really understanding what the exact situation was, what was Article 370 or what was CAA, etc. It's a general global discomfort when you hear that India, this temple of democracy, such things are happening. And so they express certain apprehensions. And I don't see it anything beyond that. But just like it happened with President Bush and President Barack Obama, I think when President Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris, I do not expect any kind of a problem in India-US relations. And also, there are no issues to worry about. So the nuclear issue was the last in our problems, because Ambassador Kapur spoke about the continuing differences, etc. But those are differences of friends and family, not differences of fundamental nature. And therefore, I don't expect this will change. And with the Chinese situation being what it is and what the US interests are, I think India and the United States are going to be partners in the years to come, regardless of the leadership.
So if I may take it on from there, if I may, with your permission, sir, say that I agree with you and I disagree with you.
Yes,
I agree with you partly, and I disagree with you on the point that, Kamala Harris's statements on Kashmir, on 370, on Foreign Minister Jaishankar not meeting Pramila Jayapal, were all very shocking to me. To me, it seemed a person who's not aware, not very well aware of international relations. And what Ambassador Srinivasan said earlier is correct, that we don't have to see her as an Indian American. She's just about there as an Indian American for her own votes. So my request to all the journalists present here today is the following: that Democrats traditionally have been a very difficult commodity for India. And when I was in the ministry at that time, Foreign Secretary Dixit asked us to draw up a balance sheet of the 50 years since independence of our relations with US, as to which administration, what happened, what were the sort of difficulties, what were the good points. So when we drew up the chart, this was in 1992-93, it became apparent for the first time to us sitting in the ministry that with each democratic administration in the US, our relations were just about manageable, very difficult at times, or impossible at times. With Republican administrations, they were at the other side. They were positive, they were good, and difficult only partly. So that we put out to the media at that time in a big way, and then the sort of country caught on that, that Democrats are not really that positively disposed towards India, and we have always had a rough ride with Democratic presidents. So that holds true even now to a great extent. I see that happening, but to the extent the differences are there, that when I hear the strategic community, as I said earlier, or the think tank community, or the political elite here, or the academic elite here discussing India-US, they are all unanimous that US relations with India are very, very important and top priority. So to that extent, Biden and Kamala Harris will adopt postures which are not so firm like Trump, but will be slightly more positive than negative towards India, is my assumption currently, unless, I emphasize unless, the Indian diaspora and the Indian media get into the act, the Indo-American Press Club members. How? Today, I see a lot of my colleagues from IITs telling me very proudly, just the other day, Philadelphia, the India Club, oh, Pradeep, we raised little less than $3 million for Biden Kamala Harris. This is my friend from IIT. He says 15 people donated more than $2 million, and then we threw it open to the vast majority, and they donated much more. So I said, what is your ask from Biden?
2 years he was here on H1B. He never got picked in the lottery.
Okay. But he has to mute. Somebody has to mute Anil. Okay, thank you. So I said, what has been your ask of Biden if you're giving him this sort of, at a shot, $3 million in 1 hour meeting? So they were not very clear. They said, what should be our ask? I said, well, if I were you, what I would say is that while we are, garnering votes for you, while we are raising funds for you and giving you funds for your election, the minimum that we request you, sir, is the following: that you have some more Indian Americans appointed in your campaign staff team. Because when I scan the campaign staff teams of Biden on the internet, this is public knowledge, this is not something which is private. All of you should go and look at it. And I scan the campaign staff team of Kamala Harris. You have to have a magnifying lens to look at which Indian is there about in those 100 names, 100 or odd names. There's just 1 or 2. Can you imagine, in a country, we are less represented in the staffing teams than even the population of the diaspora in the US, in spite of having such eminent diaspora people in administrations of Obama and Bush and Clinton and Trump now. So many eminent Indians. So I said, this is your ask, that you say a percentage of the funds we have raised for your election campaign has to be devoted towards expenditure for Indian American campaign staff in your advisory teams. There are Pakistanis and hardly any Indians, by the way. And in your transition teams, when you take over as president or vice president in your transition teams, what will happen with that is that they will get a better understanding of what Kashmir means to India, what 370 means, what NRC means, what CA means. And instead of giving bland negative statements on these aspects, like both have done, Biden and Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris also spoken on foreign minister not meeting Pramila Jayapal. They will at least be more tempered in their reactions on anything concerning India. So what my request to all of you is, please write these in your media articles, that Indian diaspora, when they support any candidate, whether it's Biden or Trump hardly needs saying, because he's already got more staffers than these two, Biden and Kamala Harris, that they need more senior advisors or advisors in the campaign staff team. They need more people in the transition teams. So automatically this will transition into more people in their administrations and more understanding of what, because Kamala Harris is not trained in international relations. Let's face it. She's never done anything.
Dr. Kapur, for the short of time, we have a couple of more questions to ask. So I'm interrupting you at this point. Dr. Anand, he was one of the panelists from this morning's talk. He wants to ask a question. Please direct the question to who I'm asking, sir. Unmute yourself. Can you unmute Dr. Anand?
Okay. Yeah, Ambassador Kapur, my question to Ambassador Kapur is, what are the chances of China and Pakistan attacking India from two sides, and what role the United States can play under, say, the Trump administration or under, say, Biden administration? And who would be the best suited for India's interest?
Well, from whatever I've learned from various sources and friends, is that the pressure on Pakistan currently is immense. It is perhaps non-stop pressure to create disruptions on the India-Pakistan border. There is a letter which may be correct or not correct, which was issued by the Pakistani Chief of Army Staff, Bajwa, to the President of Azad Kashmir, or Prime Minister of Azad Kashmir, whatever he's called, saying that there are a lot of desertions taking place in the Pakistani army in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and whether the administration could help in some way to not let it happen in such a scale. So the pressure on Pakistan is, just like all these countries which I mentioned earlier, is tremendous. But I don't know whether Pakistan has the current interest to do that and suffer losses on its own. And if there is a full-scale war which breaks out between India and China, and India gets distracted on the China front, then the chances of Pakistan launching an attack on the Indian side of their border is more likely. But till that happens, it is unlikely. And now with the winter setting in the Ladakh area, I guess we have to do what we have done so far, hold our positions, consolidate, and occupy positions which are possible to occupy. So that sort of thing will make them think twice before doing anything incorrect and coming to the negotiating table with a negotiating attitude.
Thank you, sir. And there is one more question from Joseph Bonoli before we wind up the session. The question is like, China has invested heavily on artificial intelligence and emerging frontline technologies. There was news that China is launching a blockchain-based global digital currency. Will it end the dollar supremacy in global foreign exchange? The question is to Ambassador Kapur.
So, sir, if I may answer that, sir, Ambassador Srinivasan, is that okay? Okay. So my son is working in this blockchain business, and we had a discussion about this just the other day. And I'm learning about this because some of my batchmates from the IIT are actually in the forefronts of blockchain technology in the world, based out of USA. So we keep on learning from them also. Yes, what is said here is correct in the sense that China is leading in the blockchain technology. And China has also, of course, been wanting to make yuan a more powerful currency and a global currency to displace the dollar, imminently, ultimately. That's why China number one hashtag. Now, with this disruption, which has taken place partly out of their own creations in so many fronts, Hong Kong and others, I see now as a China number one dream receding into the distant future, or if not vanishing altogether from the Chinese screens and the world screens. In the sense, they may never become number one now. And let us see how the whole thing plays out in the future. That is my reading. Digital currency, artificial intelligence, yes, they will keep on getting more prominent and more eminent positions in the world because of the resources they have already devoted to these aspects. So they will become important, but I don't see them becoming as a preeminent global currency or global economic power anytime in the next so many decades or ever now.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. Like, we are coming to the end of the session. Thank you, speakers, for the most thought-provoking talk. We have challenged you have challenged each of us by more promptly vigilant to the situations around us and help repair India's relationship with other countries, especially US and Canada. I, on behalf of IAPC and the entire team and the participants here together, and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to both speakers for gracing your thoughts and sharing with us your opinions today. Thank you all who joined through different platforms. Enjoy the rest of the day, and over to organizing committee for the next program update. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, TP Srinivasan sir, for joining past midnight, waking up and staying up with us. Thank you so much. That was a very good interview. On behalf of Indo-American Press Club, the Board of Directors, and the National Executive Committee, we wholeheartedly extend our thanks for supporting the organization and leading a wonderful topic on India's relationship with US. Likewise, Ambassador Kapur, you have been a long-time friend of our Indo-American Press Club. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you very much. For the short of time, there were a few other questions, but we are cutting it short. It was not deliberate. So hope the panelists, the participants in this group will understand the same. Thank you very much. I request everybody to join back at 7:30 p.m., 7:30 p.m. For the closing ceremony of our Indo-American Press Club ceremony. It's an award ceremony. Please join back. I request everybody to join the ceremony with our backdrop. Okay. We'll see you soon in the evening session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Srinivasan. Thank you, IAPC. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for keeping awake for this event. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.